I think it's pretty clear those have negative health consequences and are detrimental to health span and longevity. And so if you really make a focus on taking those things out, then you still have a lot of options for what you could put into the healthy diet bucket for the long term. I think is probably something that's worth paying some attention to. My name is Matt Kaeberlein, and welcome to the Optispan YouTube channel. Hey everyone, welcome to the Optispan podcast. My name is Matt Kaeberlein, and I'm joined today by Nick Arapis, the newest member of the Optispan team. And Nick comes with a long time interest in health and wellness and fitness, and has been doing a deep dive into longevity recently, and so has a few questions that he's put together for me about the longevity field, and in particular, I think some of the myths in the longevity field potentially. So I have not seen these questions yet, so I'm really not sure what's going to happen here. But let's go ahead and just take it away and tell me what you got.
All right, Matt. So the first one is, one meal a day is best for longevity because it leads to less mTOR and insulin spikes.
So I mean, that's a common, I think, perception, at least among certain parts of the longevity community. And really this, I think, stems from some of the literature on intermittent fasting. So again, I think always when we talk about nutrition and nutritional interventions, it's really important when we think about the data to differentiate between, what we know from humans and what we know from studies in laboratory animals. And in particular, in the case of dietary interventions, most of those studies are going to be in laboratory rodents, usually in mice, sometimes in rats. So I think this really, the evidence to support the idea that one meal a day or intermittent fasting is a pro-longevity intervention really comes only from studies in laboratory animals. And what we know there is that intermittent fasting, which I'm going to define as at least 24 hours of fasting, so more than a day, is associated with increased lifespan in mice, but really only when you also have a reduction in calories. And what I mean by that is that on the days where the mice aren't fasting, they don't make up for the fasting days. So the question I think that remains even in the mouse studies is the lifespan benefit there coming from caloric restriction, or is it coming from intermittent fasting? Now, you asked specifically about one meal a day, so I would define that as time-restricted feeding, where we just shorten the window of time to, whatever length of time it takes to eat one meal a day. If you're eating every day, we really don't have much data in laboratory animals to support the idea that time-restricted feeding has a big effect on longevity, or really any effect on longevity. Certainly no evidence independent of caloric restriction. So that comes from the laboratory studies. In humans, it's really hard to make any claims around longevity from a nutritional intervention in humans, but I really don't know of any evidence that would cause me to think that as sort of a one-size-fits-all solution, one meal a day is a pro-longevity strategy. What I would say is that we know that overeating is an anti-longevity strategy. There are lots of bad stuff associated with being overweight and obese. And so I certainly believe that for some people, restricting yourself to eating one meal a day is a very useful tool to prevent overeating and obesity. Whether or not there are any longevity benefits associated with it outside of that, I just don't think we have any data to really answer that one way or the other.
All right. So my next one for you is, metformin should be taken by everyone interested in longevity, not just type 2 diabetics.
Yeah, I definitely don't fall into the metformin should be taken by everyone camp. And I don't even know that the real metformin advocates would go quite that far. But I think it is an interesting question whether or not metformin has longevity or health span benefits in people who are non-diabetic. My personal view is that it probably is the case that metformin can have some benefits for health span, maybe longevity in pre-diabetics. And there are lots of people out there who are pre-diabetic and don't know they're pre-diabetic. And my intuition is metformin could be beneficial in many of those people. I'm not yet convinced that metformin has a net beneficial effect for health span in people who are not metabolically compromised, so non-diabetics who have sort of a healthy metabolic homeostasis. And I think always this is true, not just of metformin, it's true for any intervention, really, even like once a day meal, one meal a day eating. you always want to think about risk and reward. And every intervention that you consider is going to have some risk associated with it, and every intervention has some possible reward. Personally, I don't think that the risk-reward ratio favors metformin use off-label in people who are not metabolically challenged, so not diabetic or pre-diabetic, because of the risks. I think we know that, you know, there are some common risks with metformin, like gastrointestinal upset, but I think what's underappreciated is many men taking metformin have a reduction in testosterone. So I would put that in the side effect risk category. And there's some accumulating evidence. It's certainly not rock solid yet, but there's some accumulating evidence that metformin use might attenuate or partially blunt benefits of certain forms of exercise. And so again, you know, I think we want to be aware that that's a potential risk of metformin and ask whether or not in people who are not metabolically compromised, what's that risk reward ratio look like? In my view, I don't take metformin, and I wouldn't recommend that people who are not pre-diabetic or diabetic take metformin specifically for potential health span benefits at this point.
All right. So my next question for you is, drinking wine will help me live longer because it contains resveratrol.
Well, let's unpack that. There are actually two things there that I think are worth commenting on. One is moderate consumption of alcohol beneficial? So let's save that for the second part, because I actually think that's a kind of an interesting discussion. And then, yeah, I mean, there was this sort of, you know, popularization of the idea that red wine in particular is healthy or healthier than other forms of wine or alcohol because it contains this molecule called resveratrol about, I don't know, probably 15, 20 years ago now. I would say that myth has been completely debunked in the scientific literature. So if you, at least for longevity, I'm certainly not going to claim that resveratrol has no benefits for any people. I don't know that's true. It very well may, probably does for certain people if you can get enough resveratrol. But the idea that resveratrol promotes longevity even in laboratory animals has been completely debunked as a generalization. So if you look at the meta-analysis that was published, I think last year, basically looking across all of the literature for lifespan studies where resveratrol was tested, dozens and dozens of studies, the net effect was zero. So I would say resveratrol is the most debunked longevity molecule that exists. So there's no reason to believe that resveratrol per se in people, certainly, and not even in laboratory animals, has a longevity promoting effect. Now, the question of, you know, does moderate consumption of alcohol have any benefits? That's a complicated discussion. It's probably worth us doing sort of a deep dive whole episode on. I think you can make a case just based purely on the epidemiology that moderate consumption of alcohol, and I think we have to be honest about what moderate means. So we're talking about one standard size drink, not an American size drink, a standard size drink per week for women, per day for women, 2 standard size drinks, no more than 2 for men per day. Just across all of the epidemiology, you can make a case that that's associated with a slightly reduced all-cause mortality risk compared to people who don't drink any alcohol at all. As we all know, epidemiological studies like that are full of all sorts of challenges. And so is that because of the alcohol, or is it because of some other, you know, nuance in the data or artifact in the data? That's harder to answer. My personal view is that many people struggle with moderate consumption of alcohol. And so if you're one of those people, probably you're better off just not drinking alcohol at all. And personally, I've cut way back on my alcohol consumption because I think that, you know, they're empty calories, first of all, by and large, and there is certainly a risk of, you know, falling into the trap of letting, you know, moderate consumption of alcohol become more than moderate consumption of alcohol. And we know alcohol has negative effects on sleep quality as well. So, you know, thinking about pros and cons, risk reward, again, I'm not sure there's much reward to be thinking about with moderate consumption of alcohol, maybe a little bit. And there is definitely a risk for many people. So I would put it in the be careful bucket.
Right. So a couple more questions about supplements for you. Okay. So since free radicals can affect aging, I should take a high amount of oxidants such as vitamin C or vitamin E to counteract that.
Yeah. So I think that's a really, really good question and important. And, you know, let's take a step back, and it's worth maybe just framing this, that one of the early theories of what caused biological aging was the free radical theory of aging, right? By a scientist named Denham Harmon, who basically posited that at least much of the aging process is driven by chemical reactions within our cells, within our bodies, that produce these things called free radicals. And those free radicals are highly reactive molecules that can then go on and damage other macromolecules in our cells through oxidation reactions. And so if that model was 100% correct, then a very simplistic idea for how you would prevent that would be to take high amounts of antioxidants as a supplement or through the diet. Basically, it's like a sponge soaking up these free radicals and preventing them from going on and causing damage. And I think, again, from a simplistic perspective, that's a useful model. I think we've learned, first of all, that while free radical damage is part of biological aging, it's by no means the whole story. So there's lots of other types of damage that happen and can accumulate. And I think also what we've learned is that biology is complicated. Like, I think anybody who's studied biology will understand this. And it's much less straightforward to say that if I just take a supplement like vitamin C or N-acetylcysteine or any other sort of antioxidant, that is going to get to the right place where it needs to get and soak up the right kinds of damage that it needs to soak up. So it turns out now, when we look at the epidemiology, it's far from clear that supplementing generically with antioxidants have large benefits on health in people. And so I think we can say that myth is debunked. The idea that all we have to do is take vitamin C, vitamin E, whatever, pick your favorite antioxidant, and we'll all stop aging. That's clear. What maybe is less clear is whether there is a net benefit on aging from taking those supplements. And again, I don't actually know the answer to that. I think the data that we've got is unclear at this point. But from a more sort of theoretical perspective, if we could get the antioxidant molecules to the right place at the right time, would that be sufficient to blunt some of the effects of biological aging? I think the answer there is probably yes. And we do have data from laboratory animals to support that idea. So maybe the way to frame it is we just don't know at this point what the right strategies are to have those beneficial antioxidant effects or how to accomplish that.
Okay. So my next question for you is, supplements are an essential part of anyone's health protocol.
So I would say that first of all, my views on this are sort of constantly evolving. I think, again, I'm wary of making generalizations, say everyone or anyone, right? I think probably there are people who exist who are getting sufficient amount of nutrients, hopefully what we would think of as an optimal amount of nutrients from diet or from other aspects of their environment, and maybe there would not be a supplement strategy that would benefit them. I think most people probably can benefit from some sort of supplements. My personal view, though, is that I tend to be relatively conservative, and certainly conservative in the supplements I recommend, and probably relatively conservative in the supplements I take. So I would say the place I would start is to identify nutrients, vitamins, minerals, things like that you can measure. And if you are deficient or suboptimal in those measurements, absolutely, supplementation can be a super valuable way to move yourself into the optimal range. So I think, vitamin D is a really good example of this. Omega-3 is a really good example of this, where we have good tools to measure that. We know many people in the population are deficient, and we know that supplementing with those nutrients can actually move people into the optimal range. Should we rely on supplements as an excuse to eat a nutrient-poor diet? Absolutely not. But I think for some people, they can be quite valuable in that way. I'm less convinced that most of the supplements that are sort of marketed for, longevity benefits or health span benefits actually have much data to back up those claims. And in particular, if we don't really have a way to measure whether somebody needs to take the supplement or whether the supplement is actually improving their health span or biomarkers of health span, I don't see a lot of good rationale for personally taking those things myself or recommending to other people that they take them.
So I've seen the phrase "we can reverse aging" thrown around a lot, and I wanted your opinion on that.
Yeah, so I think this is it's a little bit of a challenging topic because different people mean different things when they say aging, right? So if we don't all have the same definition, then, we may not mean the same thing when we say reverse aging. So I think, first of all, it's worth talking about, what do we mean when we're talking about aging? Personally, I think about aging as the biological mechanisms that cause a young organism, a mouse or a dog or a person, to become old and certainly contribute to the risk of developing all of the functional declines and diseases that go along with old age. So in some ways you can think of it as types of damage, think of it as a loss of homeostasis at a molecular level, but that's what I mean when I'm talking about aging. As opposed to health, I think a lot of people, when they say reverse aging, what they really mean is reversing declines in health. Is biological aging the same as a decline in health? They're overlapping, but they're not equivalent, right? You can have a decline in health without biologically aging at all. I could, walk out of this room, get hit by a car. I didn't biologically age, but my health went down, right? And the reverse is also true. So I think when people say, we have things that can reverse aging, often they're talking about things that can improve health. Absolutely, I think that we can improve health. And, that's certainly not anything, shocking, right? We've known for decades that if you take sedentary 50-year-old who's been eating a crappy diet for 2 decades and you improve their diet and get them to start exercising and sleeping well, their health is going to improve. And we can see that by biomarkers. We can see it by functional measures. We can probably see it by how they feel, right? How happy they are. So health can improve. Is that reversing aging? I would argue no. And I would argue that, the people who are talking about reversing aging today in the longevity field are either talking about health, or the other way you often see this phrase used is they're talking about one very specific metric of aging, a molecular metric of aging referred to as epigenetic age. We'll get into more detail about what that actually means in other episodes, I'm sure. But I would just say epigenetic age is only one feature that changes with age. And it's a molecular feature, but in principle, it's no different than hair getting gray, right? Most people, as they get older, their hair turns gray. Can you reverse that? Sure, I can go get my hair dyed. Did I reverse biological aging? No, I didn't reverse biological aging. And I think the same thing will apply to epigenetic changes that go along with age, except those are molecular. And you could make an argument more associated with biological age. So what I would want to see, if I was going to believe that somebody had really reversed aging, is take an old animal, an old mouse, an old dog, an old person, and you make them young again. And they're young, not just in one measure or 2 measures, but in every measure that we can actually see that goes along with biological aging. If somebody did that, I would be convinced that they have reversed biological aging. Nobody has done that, okay? Let me just be clear for the viewing audience. Nobody has taken an old mouse and made it young again. Nobody has reversed aging in a mouse. So people who are out there claiming that this has been done are deceiving people, I would say. And that's unfortunate, but that's the reality.
Okay, so just to reiterate, if you had somebody who's 40 years old and they got all their biomarkers, their VO2 max, to say a 20-year-old, they did not reverse aging.
Well, what do you mean by all their biomarkers? Again, this is the question, like how many is enough to actually convince you that they have reversed biological aging? I would say if you have reversed biological aging at sort of the core level throughout the whole body, that should be true for biomarkers of aging in every tissue and organ in the body, right? Is it possible to improve the function of a heart? Yeah, absolutely. But again, I would say we've known that for decades. Like this is nothing new or revolutionary, right? We've known that you can improve heart function through exercise for decades. So is showing that you can reverse a molecular marker of aging in the heart any different fundamentally than showing that you can improve function? Probably not, and actually probably less relevant in a lot of ways. So again, I think it's important to differentiate between reversing one or a subset of phenotypes, traits that change with age, versus actually reversing biological aging to the point where you've taken an old organism and really made it young again.
All right, so my next question is there a superior diet for longevity, and is it vegan or carnivore on that spectrum?
Boy, you're really trying to get me in trouble here, aren't you? So here's what I would say. I personally don't believe that there's a one-size-fits-all answer. And again, I think we have to be really careful to differentiate between what we know from animal studies in rodents versus the data in humans. So I think it's fair to say, if you look at just the mouse studies, what's clear is that caloric restriction, almost independently of how you restrict calories, whether it's protein or fat or carbs, caloric restriction, or all three, can increase lifespan in many cases. Not every case. There are some genetic backgrounds where we see that caloric restriction is actually harmful or it has no effect. But in many cases, that can increase lifespan. There isn't a lot of data outside of that to suggest what the sort of optimal diet is. There have been a couple of studies reporting that a ketogenic diet can have very small effects on lifespan, but nowhere near the same magnitude as caloric restriction. And there is a body of literature suggesting that protein restriction, specifically in certain genetic backgrounds of mice and rats, can have a beneficial effect on longevity. So that's what we know in the animal studies. I think we have to be very careful, though, about extrapolating that to humans, in particular in the nutrition area, because I think that the consequences of these kinds of diets are potentially very different in humans who live in a very complex environment and who are also susceptible to some age-related dysfunction and diseases that we don't really see very much in mice, like, for example, sarcopenia, so loss of muscle mass, muscle function as we get older. That really isn't a health span or longevity limiting phenotype in mice. Mice do show a loss of muscle mass, but that doesn't really become as much of a health span limiting feature in mice as it is in people. Conversely, most mice in the laboratory will develop cancer, and I think the preponderance of evidence is that most mice in the laboratory die from cancer. A lot of people die from cancer, but it's not the leading cause of death in people. Cardiovascular disease is. So there's just differences in the way the biology of aging manifests itself in terms of pathology and disease. Why am I getting into that? Because I think protein restriction is a really interesting case example where, sure, in certain genetic backgrounds of mice, protein restriction is very beneficial from a longevity perspective. But I think in people, we have to be very concerned about loss of muscle mass, sarcopenia, and the risk of falls and fractures and things like that if we were to recommend something like protein restriction for people. It's just a different situation in humans and mice. So then now thinking about the human data, I'm not really convinced that there is a lot of data to suggest that there's one diet that's better than all the others. I think if you had to pick one, you could make a pretty reasonable case for a Mediterranean diet. But I also believe that oftentimes these sorts of, again, epidemiological studies that look at different types of diets in people can be confounded by the populations that they're studying. Like, for example, and again, this will probably get me in trouble. I know the haters will not like this, but my reading of the literature is you can at least make a reasoned argument that much of the negative associations with red meat consumption can be attributed to the quality of the diet that people who eat a lot of red meat tend to eat, which is generally lower quality. And when you normalize for the quality of the diet, a lot of the negative effects of red meat consumption go away. Does that mean red meat's healthy for you? No, I'm not going to say that. But I think sometimes these negative associations with certain components of the diet can actually be caused or misinterpreted because of the way the studies are done, and they don't really control for the quality of the diet. Do I think you can eat a healthy diet, a high quality diet, and still have some red meat? Yeah, I personally do. And so I'm really hesitant to say there's a one size fits all. I think where I land is, this is partly through my own self-experimentation, is finding a healthy diet that works for you. I think there are many types of healthy diet. I think we can probably have better agreement about what's unhealthy or what has a negative effect on longevity. And I would put things like high amounts of simple sugars, lots of foods with added sugars, high amounts of ultra-processed foods. I think it's pretty clear those have negative health consequences and are detrimental to health span and longevity. And so if you really make a focus on taking those things out, then you still have a lot of options for what you could put into the healthy diet bucket. And then finding one that works for you where you can actually maintain that for the long term, I think is probably something that's worth paying some attention to.
All right. So the next potential myth is aging is a disease and therefore it can be solved.
So again, let me break that up into two parts. So can aging be solved? I believe it can, but I also believe we're nowhere near doing that. So again, I think that we need to be clear. You'll hear some people out there talking about how, we're on the cusp of solving aging, or we're near longevity escape velocity, which is the idea that, the pace of research is going to lead to life expectancy gains faster than the flow of chronological time. I haven't seen any data to make me believe we're anywhere near longevity escape velocity or immortality or solving aging. But from a theoretical perspective, that should be possible. If we can understand the biological mechanisms of aging sufficiently well and create tools, technologies, strategies to target those mechanisms in a safe way, and I think that's possible, in principle, aging is solvable. Is it a disease? I actually think this is really a semantic argument. I don't like to spend much time on this because I think people can get really hot and bothered about, this debate. And really, it comes down to how you define disease. And so I tend not to engage in that debate. I think what's more important is that people appreciate that biological aging is modifiable, right? And once you understand that, then whether we call it a disease or not, I think that opens the door to the fact that we can actually do something about it. And we can actually target the biology of aging, through lifestyle interventions, through drugs, potentially through supplements, to delay the onset and progression of multiple age-related functional declines and diseases. And that's really the important point. I think part of the reason, I think it's worth doing a little bit of a deeper dive on two concepts there. One is this idea of lifestyle interventions. This is actually really important. I don't think most people have made the connection yet. The reason why healthy diet, regular exercise, good quality sleep impact multiple age-related diseases is because they're impacting the biology of aging, right? That's why they have an effect on health, broadly speaking, all-cause mortality, multiple functional declines, and diseases of old age. So that's an important concept. I think some people really feel strongly that we need to define aging as a disease because they believe that that's a necessary step in order to get FDA or other regulatory bodies to consider approving a drug or an intervention to target aging, right? For aging as the endpoint. I actually think that's a myth. I don't think that that's necessary for FDA to consider approving a drug to target aging. I think what FDA really cares about is whether you can show quantitatively, right? You've got to be able to measure it, show quantitatively that you can improve a health span metric, so quality or quantity, lifespan, quantity of life. You don't have to show that you've cured a disease or that you've cured aging. You just have to show that you can improve the quality of people's lives or you can extend their lifespan. And you have to be able to measure it. So even if we defined aging as a disease, I don't think that helps from the perspective of a regulatory body because you still have to be able to measure it. So then how do we measure it, right? So then this gets into, can we use aging clocks and all of that? That's a deeper conversation. But the answer is right now, FDA is not going to accept aging clocks or any other molecular metric of aging as the endpoint for a clinical trial to approve a drug for aging. So I think it's a little bit of a disconnect that some people are confused about the need to define aging as a disease because it will somehow then enable regulatory approval of a drug to target aging.
Okay, so my next series of questions all kind of come from popular criticisms you might hear about the field. So the first one is longevity is determined by genes, and there's really not much we can do about it.
Right. So that's wrong. I mean, it's not completely wrong. Longevity is determined to some extent by genetics. We don't really know exactly how much, but I think the current estimates are around 20% of human longevity is genetic, which would mean that 80% is environmental. And under environment are all sorts of stuff. So diet, pollution, exercise even goes under environment, sleep quality, human interactions, all of those things fit in that environment bucket. But genetics is, by a percentage metric, actually the smaller component of longevity compared to environment.
Okay. And so the next one is longevity is something that concerns older people, and being in your 20s or 30s, really you don't have to think about it.
There's a few things to say about that. One is, how do you define older? So when do we start to see functional declines in people, right? I would say you can actually start to see some functional declines in your 30s. Definitely by the time you're in your 40s for most people. So do you define that as older or not? I don't know, but I think certainly you can push the clock back easily to 30s and 40s. Would it be great if we could prevent many of those functional declines in the 30s and 40s by starting to pay attention to health in your 20s, that'd be fantastic, right? So I think that's one partial answer to that question. The other is, I think, maybe a little bit more interesting from a scientific perspective, which is, how malleable is biological aging once the functional declines have already occurred? And here I think there's room for optimism. I think many of us in the field have been surprised over the last couple of decades to see that, again, at least in mice, you can actually reverse certainly a lot of the functional declines that go along with aging, and also at a molecular level, you can reverse some of the molecular declines that go along with aging, at least in certain tissues and organs. So I think there's reason for optimism that, if you're in your 50s like me, it's not too late. You can still get some benefits from paying attention to biological aging. But are the benefits larger if you start paying attention earlier? Almost certainly. And so I think, if you're trying to look at net potential benefit overall, you're going to be better off paying attention to your health, optimizing your health, trying to reduce the effects of biological aging as much as possible, as early as possible.
Okay, so I think in the mainstream, some people view longevity as a thing where you have to be a billionaire CEO in Silicon Valley to take full advantage of.
Yeah, that's really unfortunate that sometimes gets presented that way in the media. So a couple of things I would say about that. One is, we've kind of already talked about lifestyle really as the best way to impact health span and longevity that we know for sure works in people today. You don't have to be a billionaire to practice a healthy lifestyle. Are there disparities in, access to quality food? Absolutely. Is it harder for some people to get access to a gym, for example, for exercise? Absolutely. But everybody can make improvements in their health span through lifestyle. I don't care if you're a billionaire or the most economically disadvantaged person in this country. Everybody can make improvements. But of course it's not an even playing field. I think where this idea of longevity for billionaires often comes up in a more pronounced manner has to do with sort of, cutting edge technologies, access to the best quality medical care, these sort of experimental things that are, may or may not work. And then, of course, there are some billionaires who are very high profile about their own sort of longevity experiments. What I would say there is, first of all, most of those sort of cutting edge experimental things that fall into these stories about longevity for billionaires, again, we don't know if they work in people. So, these guys might just be shortening their lifespans. I don't know. Secondly, I think it's worth noting the things that I would put in the bucket of sort of experimental, but with the most likelihood of having an impact on longevity, and I'd put rapamycin in that bucket, aren't that expensive. Once we have some therapies that have been shown through, say, clinical trials or through large scale, epidemiological studies to have an impact on health span and potentially lifespan, especially if they've gone through the clinical trial process, let's say the first drug that's approved by the FDA for longevity, or maybe it's a gene therapy, will that only be available? Will it be very expensive? Will it only be available to certain people? That's hard to predict right now. I think it really depends on what that intervention looks like, what sort of technologies were used to develop it. Certainly possible that it will be expensive and not available to everyone. And I think, that's something to pay attention to. And my hope would be that as more people become familiar with the science in this field, as it becomes sort of more well-known, as it starts to be thought about in political circles, in the government, that steps can be taken to make sure that access is available to as many people as possible. And certainly that's, our sort of mission at Optispan is to take the tools that we have available now and make them to optimize health span and make them as available to as many people as possible as we possibly can. And my hope is that, again, as recognition in this space grows, that steps can be taken at every level to help ensure that everybody has access to the best strategies to improve lifespan and health span.
All right. So my last comment for you is, if somebody wants to make it well over 100, they had to have been fortunate enough to have been born in a blue zone.
Well, I mean, first of all, obviously that's not true. There are many people who make it over 100 who are not born in a blue zone. And I think, again, there's lots of things that go into making it to live more than 100. The thing I would also say is that, the world now is very different than it was 50 years ago, right? Even 20 years ago. And so I think what we're seeing is that more people are living to be over 100. The question is, are more people living to be over 100 in good health? I don't think we know the answer to that. And that's really the goal, right? The goal isn't just to make it to 100, it's to make it to 100 and still be able to do the stuff you want to be able to do in your daily life and to be able to do it well. And so, this question of the blue zones, I think that's probably, again, we need to do a deeper dive to really talk about the blue zones and the evidence for the blue zones. And, some of the evidence may be suggesting that maybe some of the interest around the blue zones is overstated. But I think certainly your likelihood of making it to an old age in good health is going to be determined partly by where you were born, which there's some luck. There's a lot. It's only luck, I guess, that goes into that. And you can't do much about that. Your genetics, we've already talked about genetics. We know there's a genetic component to living to be over 100. Luck, being able to avoid the major killers, and lifestyle. So, certainly you can point to the famous cases of people who lived to be over 100 and, drank every day and didn't eat well. But by and large, people who make it to extreme old age in good health are also people who've practiced a healthy lifestyle. Those are all things that are independent of living in a blue zone that will apply to everybody everywhere. And so I think, you can only control what you can control, and we should control the factors that we can take action on to give ourselves the best chance of making it to 100, maybe 90 in really good health and being able to have a high quality, high functioning life.
Thank you. I think you debunked a lot of myths today.
Awesome. So thanks, Nick. And so thank you for watching this video. If this is the kind of content that you like, please, even if you don't, leave a comment in the comment section below. If we see that lots of people like this kind of content, we'll do more of it. And I hope you come back often to the Optispan YouTube channel.